Hook. He had built an empire on one skill. Not intelligence. Not capital. Not the ruthlessness that financial journalists liked to attribute to him in magazine profiles he never read. The skill was simpler than any of those. He knew how to see what other people walked past. He had seen it in a failing freight route nobody else wanted, and turned it into a logistics network worth $3 billion. He had seen it in a port contract everyone else considered too complicated, and used it to control half the country's coastal supply chain. He had seen it in collapsing companies, undervalued assets, and overlooked infrastructure. He had built his entire life on the assumption that the most valuable things in the world were the ones nobody was paying attention to. And then, on a Tuesday night in late October, in the marble kitchen of his own penthouse, he walked past it, almost. The music was soft enough to ignore. The hour was late enough to dismiss. The man dancing barefoot on the kitchen floor was, on paper, by every category the world used to measure people, nobody. Riven Calderon stopped in the doorway. And for once in 15 years of building an empire on the ability to see clearly, he looked. What happened next cost him everything he thought he understood about value, intelligence, and the specific arrogance of powerful men who believe that talent always arrives wearing the right credentials. It also, eventually, inconveniently, and in ways he had not budgeted for, cost him his certainty that he was better off alone. This is that story. Chapter 1. The Midnight Observation. There are men who believe they have mastered the world around them. Riven Calderon was one of them. At 39, he was the kind of man who arrived in a room before anyone else felt his presence and left it still echoing long after he was gone. His name appeared in financial journals beside words like ruthless and visionary and untouchable. His logistics empire, Calderon Group, quietly powered the supply chains of nearly half the country's major corporations. Rail freight, cargo routing, port operations. If something moved from one coast to the other with speed and precision, there was a reasonable chance Riven had something to do with it. He had built it alone, started with nothing but a second-hand truck and a route nobody else wanted, and turned it into a machine worth billions. The price of that machine was everything else. By the time he was 30, he had already traded warmth for efficiency, conversation for calculation, connection for control. His penthouse atop a glass tower on the Upper West Side was not a home. It was a system, a perfectly calibrated environment where every piece of furniture, every staff rotation, every light setting had been selected for function over comfort. The kitchen stocked itself. The laundry ran on a cycle. Employees arrived and disappeared like subroutines. Their names interchangeable, their roles replaceable. Riven preferred it that way. Emotion, in his experience, was simply a variable that introduced unnecessary risk. The night it began was a Tuesday in late October. He returned at 11:43 p.m. from a board meeting that had stretched into something close to warfare. A merger negotiation. A freight competitor's acquisition, worth roughly $2.4 billion, had stalled over liability clauses and senior executives who were too proud to blink first. Riven had sat at the head of the table in silence while 3 lawyers argued and 2 board members sweated. And then he had said 7 words. Sign the amendment or walk away now. They signed. He always found it slightly tedious when people forgot he had already thought 10 steps ahead of wherever they currently stood. Back in the penthouse, the staff had already retired. The automated systems had dimmed the lights to 30%. A glass of water sat on the kitchen island, placed there by protocol, untouched as always. Riven loosened his tie, dropped his briefcase beside the entryway credenza, and began the walk toward his private office to review the evening's signed documents before sleep. He never made it, because somewhere past the hallway that split toward the eastern wing, he heard something. Music. Not loud. Not intrusive. Just a soft, low rhythm drifting from beyond the half-open kitchen door, the kind of sound that didn't belong to any scheduled system in the house. Riven paused mid-stride. His first instinct was annoyance. Automated speakers weren't supposed to activate after 10. He would note it as a maintenance error in the morning and have it corrected. But his second instinct, the quieter, more dangerous one, was curiosity. He moved toward the kitchen doorway and stopped. Inside the warm circle of hanging pendant lights, a young man was dancing. He was barefoot on the marble floor, his white service shirt untucked, dark red hair loose around his face. He moved slowly at first, just swaying with his eyes half closed, head tilted back, and then with more intention, more shape, arms rising into something deliberate and precise. He was tall, lean, and moved with a kind of controlled grace that had no business existing inside someone paid to change bedsheets. Riven recognized training when he saw it. This wasn't someone letting off steam. This was someone remembering a language their body still knew fluently. The young man, Sable, the residential staff registry read. Sable Voss. New hire. 2 weeks in service. Previously placed through a domestic staffing agency. Age, 26. Prior employment. Various. Spun once and nearly knocked over a bowl of fruit on the counter, then caught it with one hand without missing a beat, laughed quietly to himself and set it right. Riven didn't move. He told himself he was simply waiting for a natural moment to announce his presence and redirect the staff member to bed. That was all. It had nothing to do with the way Sable's expression in that lit kitchen looked like the first honest thing Riven had seen in weeks. Then the music shifted. Something slower, almost melancholy, and Sable stopped dancing. He walked to the kitchen island, wiped his hands on a cloth, and pulled a notebook from beneath the counter. Riven watched him open it, and something changed in the quality of his attention entirely. The notebook was dense. Even from the doorway shadow, Riven could see it. Pages covered in small, precise markings. Diagrams, measurements, intersecting lines drawn with the kind of patience that came from someone who understood what they were drawing mattered. Not notes, structural schematics. Riven had built a logistics empire. He had signed off on the construction of 3 private distribution facilities in the last decade alone. He knew what engineering documentation looked like. He knew the language of load-bearing calculation and tensile force and support distribution. What Sable Voss had spread across his kitchen island at midnight was not a journal. It was a bridge design. Sable muttered something under his breath, erased a section with the eraser end of his pencil, and recalculated, tapping the eraser against his lip while his eyes moved rapidly across the page. His brow furrowed. He drew a new support line, studied it, shook his head slightly. Still too much lateral stress here, Sable whispered to himself. If the wind load exceeds baseline assumptions by even 12%, the whole tension system shifts. He flipped back 2 pages, cross-referenced something, then returned to the current diagram, and nodded once. There. Riven's jaw was tight. His mind, the same mind that had reduced the careers of 4 rival CEOs without raising his voice, was running an analysis it hadn't asked permission to begin. The question was simple and complicated at the same time. Who was this man? Not who the staffing agency said he was. Not the quiet, efficient residential aide who had replaced the previous maid after a scheduling conflict and arrived on a Monday with 2 bags and very little eye contact. The real question was, what was Sable Voss doing cleaning penthouses at $200 a week when he clearly understood structural engineering mechanics well enough to solve problems at midnight in someone else's kitchen? Riven stepped back from the doorway before Sable looked up. He didn't announce himself. He didn't speak. He turned quietly and walked back down the hallway toward his office. Not because he had somewhere urgent to be, but because the particular sensation building in his chest was one he rarely allowed to run unchecked. Interest. Genuine, unscheduled, mildly inconvenient interest. At his desk, Riven sat without turning on the lamp. The Manhattan skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass threw faint light across the room. He looked at the merger documents in front of him and didn't read a single word. After a long moment, he reached forward and opened his laptop. He pulled up the residential staff registry, found Sable Voss. Read the file, sparse, clean, professionally formatted. Date of hire, service history, 2 character references, a phone number, a domestic agency ID number. Nothing unusual. Nothing to explain what Riven had just seen. He closed the file. Then he opened a different window. his secure communications line to the investigative firm he retained for background vetting on merger partners and corporate rivals. A firm that was very good at finding what wasn't meant to be found. He typed a single name, Sable Voss, then added a second line, full background, academic, employment, legal, prior addresses, everything. He sent the message. Then finally leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling in the dark, doing something he almost never did. Waiting. 3 days later, the report arrived. Riven read it once, then read it again more slowly, and when he finally set it down on the desk and looked out at the Manhattan skyline in the early morning gray, his expression was not the focused neutrality he wore to board meetings or the controlled calm he used with his legal team. It was something rarer. Something close to recognition. The man cleaning his home was not who he appeared to be. And Riven Calderon, who had built an empire on the ruthless ability to see the value others overlooked, was already asking himself a question that would cost him far more than $1 billion merger. What exactly had they done to Sable Voss? And who had let them? Chapter 2. The Report. The file was 47 pages long. Riven read it at his desk as the city outside moved from dark to gray, untouched coffee going cold beside him. He was a fast reader by habit, trained to extract essential information from dense documents at speed. He had reviewed merger contracts, forensic audits, competitive intelligence reports. He was not a man who slowed down for paper. He slowed down for this one. Because every few pages, something appeared that made him stop and reread. Sable Voss, 26 years old, originally from Portland, Oregon, raised by a single father, a civil engineer who worked for the State Transportation Department for 22 years before retiring early due to illness. The father, one Marcus Voss, was apparently the kind of man who brought work home in the best possible sense. Design manuals stacked in the living room, drafting tools on the kitchen table, bridge documentation spread across every flat surface. Sable had grown up inside the language of structural engineering the way other children grew up inside music or sport. It was the vocabulary of his childhood. At 17, he won a regional mathematics competition sponsored by a major civil engineering firm. At 18, he published an independent analysis of suspension bridge failure modes in a small academic journal, which was, his investigators noted carefully, later cited by 3 separate published papers by professionals with decades more experience. At 20, he entered the structural engineering program at the Harwick Institute of Technology on a full academic scholarship. By 22, he was considered one of the most promising graduate researchers in the department. By 23, he was gone. Riven set down his coffee cup. Slowly. The middle section of the report was where the investigators had done their most careful work, and Riven could tell they had found it uncomfortable to compile. Institutional wrongdoing was messy territory. People lawyered up. Records vanished. Witnesses developed strategic amnesia. But the paper trail apparently had survived. Sable's graduate research project. A novel approach to tension cable distribution in asymmetric bridge designs, reducing material cost by roughly 18% while increasing load tolerance, had attracted significant attention in the department. His supervising professor, one Dr. Aldrich Fenmore, had taken a particular interest in the work. According to university records, Fenmore had requested sole co-supervisory access to the project files in Sable's second year. Standard procedure, it was framed as mentorship. 8 months later, Fenmore submitted a research paper to a prestigious engineering journal. Under his name only, the paper described a novel approach to tension cable distribution in asymmetric bridge designs. Riven read that sentence 3 times. Then he kept reading. When Sable confronted Fenmore privately, the professor denied everything. Claimed the ideas had developed independently in parallel, a coincidence of academic focus. When Sable escalated to the department chair, he was told that since Fenmore held senior supervisory access to the shared research files, the intellectual origin of the work was, at minimum, disputed. When Sable escalated further, to the University Ethics Committee, the chair submitted a preemptive complaint claiming Sable had engaged in unprofessional conduct toward a senior faculty member. The Ethics Committee investigated Sable, not Fenmore. The scholarship was suspended pending inquiry. The inquiry produced a formal finding of insufficient evidence of misconduct by either party. Language so deliberately neutral it functioned as a verdict against the person with less institutional power. Sable appealed. The appeal was denied. The scholarship, once suspended, was not reinstated. By the time he left Harwick, Sable Voss had no degree, no funding, a formal academic dispute notation on his educational record, and a supervising professor who had just received a significant grant based on work that, according to Sable's own preliminary notebooks, which the investigators had managed to locate through an academic archivist, Sable had developed first. Major engineering firms, informed of the dispute notation during reference checks, had declined to interview him. 3 years of domestic service employment followed. Housekeeping, residential management, whatever paid. Riven closed the report. He sat for a moment in the early morning quiet of his office, listening to the city 40 floors below do the thing cities do, move regardless. Then he stood, straightened his jacket by reflex, and went to find his building operations manager to request an adjustment to the household duty schedule. He wanted Sable assigned to the East Wing maintenance rotation for the next 2 weeks. Better hours, lighter physical load. It was a small thing. He told himself it was simply efficient management of a resource he hadn't fully evaluated yet. He did not examine that reasoning too closely. The next 17 days became an exercise in the kind of attention Riven usually reserved for acquisition targets. He didn't approach Sable directly. Men like Riven didn't show their interest until they understood its full shape. Instead he watched, from doorways, from the corner of his eye during briefings when Sable moved through the background of the penthouse. From the security feed review, he began conducting each morning with his operations manager under the framing of staff efficiency assessment. What he observed was methodical, quiet, and deeply strange for someone whose official function was residential maintenance. On day 3, Sable reorganized the household inventory system. This was not in his job description. It also wasn't a dramatic gesture. He simply noticed, apparently while restocking the supply closet, that the current inventory categorization created redundant ordering cycles. He redesigned it on a spare notepad, showed it to the household manager, Ms. Okafor, and she implemented it without quite realizing she was adopting a supply chain optimization model. When Riven's operations director reviewed the quarterly household expenditure summary 10 days later, he noted a 14% reduction in supply costs and attributed it to process improvements. Riven knew exactly where it had come from. On day 7, the automated irrigation system in the rooftop garden failed. The building's contracted maintenance firm sent 2 technicians who spent 4 hours and concluded the issue was a faulty sensor array that would require a full replacement order. A 3-week wait and a significant cost. Sable, apparently returning gardening tools to the roof storage area and finding the technicians still there, had looked at the system for approximately 6 minutes before identifying a pressure valve misalignment that was triggering a false sensor reading. He corrected it manually. The technicians stared at him. He said nothing, collected the gardening tools, and left. The irrigation system ran perfectly for the remainder of the month. On day 11, Riven held a working lunch in the main conference room with 3 of his senior operations executives. Sable brought in water and a tray of materials, moving efficiently and without eye contact, as staff were trained to do. Except at one point, Riven, watching from beneath the appearance of reviewing a document, noticed Sable pause fractionally near the conference table. On the table was a draft route optimization map for the company's new southern corridor, a logistical puzzle his operations team had been debating for 6 weeks. Sable looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he left the room. That evening, Sable's duty log included a note, addressed to Ms. Okafor for general building operations, flagging a potential pressure irregularity in the conference room's HVAC unit. Completely routine maintenance observation. At the bottom of the note, in smaller writing, was a separate line that read, also notice the southern route draft on the conference table. The bottleneck at the Baton Rouge junction could probably be resolved by splitting into 2 regional hubs rather than 1 central relay. Apologies if this is not my place to mention. Ms. Okafor had forwarded it to General Building Management. It had never reached Riven's desk. He found it only because he had begun reviewing all staff communications as part of his efficiency assessment. He read the note about the Baton Rouge junction twice. Then he went to find his logistics director and asked him, casually, whether anyone had considered a dual regional hub model for the Southern Corridor. His logistics director stared at him. "That's actually exactly what we needed," the man said slowly. "How did you?" "Keep working on it," Riven said and left. The company crisis arrived on a Thursday. A billion-dollar infrastructure contract, a highway overpass project that Calderon Group had taken on as a prestige venture to expand beyond logistics into construction management, was failing at the design stage. The structural engineering subcontractor had delivered plans that 3 independent review firms had flagged as potentially dangerous. Specific concern: the central span's load distribution design would perform adequately under standard conditions but showed vulnerability under compound stress scenarios. High traffic load combined with seismic activity or severe weather. The investors were already nervous. If the design was rejected and the timeline pushed back, Calderon Group faced a penalty clause worth tens of millions. If the design moved forward and later failed, in testing, in review, or worse, in construction, the liability exposure was catastrophic. Riven convened an emergency strategy session that ran until nearly midnight. His engineering team argued. His legal team argued louder. 2 of his senior board members had arrived in person, which was never a good sign. Riven sat at the head of the table and listened to all of it and felt, with a kind of cold clarity, that his team was not going to solve this tonight. Possibly not this week. Because the problem wasn't effort or resources. The problem was that no one in the room had the specific technical intuition to see what was actually wrong with the design fast enough to fix it before the investor deadline. He looked at the structural schematics spread across the table. At the central span load distribution diagram in particular. And something shifted in the back of his mind. Because he had seen Sable Voss look at a notebook full of bridge schematics and whisper to himself about lateral stress and tension cable ratios. And he had read a 47-page report about a young man whose research on tension cable distribution in asymmetric bridge designs had been considered innovative enough to steal. Riven looked at the diagram in front of him. Looked at the specific failure point the review firms had identified. Then he looked at the time, 11:48 p.m. He pushed back his chair. "Take a break," he said to the room. 30 minutes. He walked out of the conference room and down the hall. And kept walking. Sable was still awake. Riven found him in the small staff lounge off the service corridor, sitting cross-legged on the couch with his notebook open on his knee, pencil moving. He looked up when Riven appeared in the doorway, and the expression on his face shifted from focus to wary in the way that people who had been burned by institutions learned to look at authority. Riven said nothing for a moment. He was used to rooms that adjusted themselves when he entered. Used to people straightening their posture and softening their voices and choosing their words carefully. What he was not used to was someone simply watching him with calm, careful eyes and waiting to find out what the powerful man in the doorway actually wanted. "I have a structural problem," Riven said finally. "Load distribution on a central span. The design is failing review." Sable's pencil stopped moving. "I'd like you to look at it." The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. But in those 4 seconds, something passed through Sable Voss's expression that Riven, for all his skill at reading people across negotiating tables, could not entirely decode. It wasn't quite surprise. It wasn't quite suspicion. It was the look of someone being handed something they wanted very badly, by someone they had no reason yet to trust. "All right," Sable said quietly. He closed the notebook and followed Riven Calderon down the hallway toward the conference room. Toward a table full of executives who were about to discover that the most important person in the building tonight had spent the previous 2 hours sitting on a staff couch with a pencil and a private notebook. None of them were ready for that. Riven was beginning to think he might be. Chapter 3. The Room That Changed. The conference room had been designed to project authority. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides. A table long enough to seat 16. Leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The art on the walls, chosen by an interior consultant, conveyed the visual language of permanence. Power that had been here a long time and intended to remain. When Riven walked Sable through the door at 8 minutes past midnight, the room contained 7 people. 2 senior board members, Harris Weld, who had been with Calderon Group for 11 years, and Petra Achabi, who held the largest single outside investor stake in the company. 3 engineers from the contracted design team, Riven's chief legal officer, Dana Morrow, and his head of operations, Gail Torres, who was the only person in the room who had worked with Riven long enough to recognize when his boss was doing something unprecedented. Torres looked at Sable once, then at Riven. His expression asked a question very loudly without making a sound. Riven ignored it. "I've asked a member of the residential staff to review the schematics," he said, in the tone that made it clear the sentence was not an opening for debate. The room processed this in stages. Harris Weld looked at Sable's white service shirt, still slightly untucked from earlier, and then at the engineering blueprints spread across the table, and then back at Riven with an expression that was making a significant effort to remain professional. "The residential staff," he repeated. "Yes, one of the contracted engineers, a man named Soares who had been the loudest voice in the pre-break argument, made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh. Not quite. Sable stood at the edge of the table. He was looking at the schematics, not at the executives, not at the tension in the room, just the blueprints. Riven said nothing. He watched. 20 seconds passed. They felt longer. Sable reached forward, slowly, without asking permission, which Petra Achabi clocked with a small tightening around her eyes, and rotated the central span diagram to face him more directly. He leaned over it. His index finger moved along the load distribution line without touching the paper. His lips moved very slightly, doing the kind of silent arithmetic that meant the calculations were already running. 30 seconds. 40. "The failure point is here," Sable said. His voice was quiet, even. The same voice he used to ask Ms. Okafor whether the East Wing needed more cleaning supplies. He pointed to the junction between the central cable anchor and the lateral support beams on the northern span. The load distribution assumes symmetric stress across both spans during peak conditions. But this junction creates an asymmetric transfer point. Under standard traffic load it holds. But add wind shear above 40 kilometers per hour, or a seismic event above 4.2, or both simultaneously, he paused. The northern anchor transfers excess force inward. The lateral beams aren't rated for the differential. You'd get progressive failure starting here and propagating east over approximately 40 seconds. The room was silent. Not the polite silence of people letting someone finish. The silence of 7 people recalibrating. Soares, the engineer who had made the almost laugh sound, was now looking at the diagram with a different expression entirely. The almost laugh was gone. In its place was something uncomfortable and professionally embarrassed. "That's," he started. "Consistent with what the review firms flagged," Sable said. "Yes, but they identified the symptom. The root cause is the anchor design choice, not the beam ratings. You could reinforce the beams and still have the same structural vulnerability under sufficient compound stress." Harris Weld leaned forward slowly. "How would you fix it?" Sable looked at him for a moment, as if the question required him to make a small decision. Then he reached for the blank notepad on the edge of the table. "May I?" No one said anything. He took it as permission. What followed was 11 minutes that Riven would find himself thinking about later in the kind of quiet, late-night honesty he rarely allowed himself. Sable sketched quickly. Not rough, not uncertain, but with the controlled speed of someone whose hand already knew where it was going. He redesigned the anchor junction, redistributed the transfer points across a triangulated support system instead of a single lateral connection. Adjusted the cable angles by 6 degrees on each side to create symmetric load paths regardless of stress direction. He narrated as he drew, not performing, just explaining, in the same way a man might explain a route he knew well to someone who'd asked for directions. Matter of fact. No jargon for its own sake. Every technical term earned its place. By the time he finished, the notepad held something that looked less like a rough sketch and more like a preliminary engineering proposal. He set the pencil down. That's the basic structural correction, he said. The precise calculations would need to be stress-tested. But the load path logic should hold. Petra Achebe, who had the kind of financial intelligence that included knowing when the technical people in the room had been outmaneuvered, looked from the sketch to the man who had drawn it. "Who are you?" she asked, directly, without the social framing people usually built around that question. Sable looked at her, then at the table, then at Riven. Something moved through his expression quickly and was gone before most people in the room could name it. But Riven caught it. He'd been watching too carefully not to. It was grief. Old grief. The kind that lives so close to the surface in a person not because the wound is fresh but because they've learned to carry it without showing it, and occasionally something, a room, a question, a moment of being seen, brings it back up without warning. "I work here," Sable said quietly. Then he picked up the sketch, placed it on the table where the investors could see it, and left the room. No one spoke for a moment after the door closed. Gail Torres was the first. "Where did you find him?" "He's been here for 3 weeks, Riven said. Torres stared at him. "Doing what?" Riven looked at the door. "Cleaning." The silence that followed this was a different kind. Heavier. Soares, the engineer, was already leaning over Sable's sketch with his own pencil out, running calculations in the margin. After about 30 seconds, he looked up and said, in a tone that cost him something to produce, "The load path correction is sound. This would address the compound stress vulnerability." Harris Weld looked at Riven for a long moment. "Get him in front of the full design team," Weld said. "First thing tomorrow." "He may not agree to that," Riven said. "Why not?" Riven picked up the sketch, looked at it, set it back down. "Because the last time someone with institutional power got access to his work, they took it from him." The room absorbed this without fully understanding it. But Petra Achebe, who had been watching Riven carefully the entire time, understood something else. The way he'd said it wasn't informational. It was protective. She filed that observation away without comment. Riven found Sable in the service corridor 20 minutes later, waiting for a lift back to the staff level. He stopped beside him without announcing himself. Sable registered his presence with the slight, controlled stillness of a person who was used to being surprised by powerful people and had learned that the safest response was to show nothing. They stood in the corridor. Neither spoke for a moment. "You didn't have to leave," Riven said finally. "You got what you needed. They want to bring you in front of the full design team." A pause. "I know what that looks like," Sable said carefully. "Someone uses you for the solution. The team presents it. 3 months later your name isn't in the room anymore." Riven said nothing for a beat, because the man wasn't wrong. That was exactly how it worked in many rooms, for many people who didn't have the institutional protection that came with a title. "I read your file," Riven said. Sable's jaw tightened slightly. "I figured. Fenmore's paper. Your original notebooks. The ethics committee." The lift arrived. Sable didn't move toward it. "Why are you telling me that?" he asked. Riven turned to look at him directly. Something he hadn't done until this moment, keeping his attention at an angle the way a man keeps his distance from something he's still deciding the value of. "Because I want you to know I understand why you left the room," Riven said. "And because I want to make you an offer that isn't contingent on whether you trust me yet." Sable looked at him. The wariness was still there. But underneath it, Riven caught it the same way he'd caught the grief, something else. Calculation. Not cold calculation. The kind that comes from a person who has been burned badly enough that they have learned to think before they feel. Who has decided that hope is only worth having if it can survive a few honest questions first. "What offer?" Sable asked. Riven looked at him for a moment. "Come to the design session," he said. "Your input presented under your name. In writing before the session starts. My legal team documents your contribution before a word gets shared with anyone else." Sable was very still. Why would you do that? It was the right question. It was the question Riven had been asking himself in some form since midnight 3 days ago. Because I've built a great deal on the ability to recognize what others miss, he said. And it would be an act of profound stupidity to repeat the mistake your last employer made. The corridor was very quiet. The lift had gone without either of them. Sable looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. The investor presentation is in 3 weeks, Riven continued. That is not enough time to fix a structural problem of this complexity through conventional channels. You already know how to fix it. I need someone who can guide the design team through the correction without losing 3 weeks to territorial debate. Sable said nothing. I'm asking you, Riven said. Not your title. Not the version of you the agency sent over. You. Another silence. Then, quietly, carefully, with the particular weight of a person making a decision they know is irreversible. I want the documentation before I walk into any room, Sable said. Every session. Every idea I contribute. In writing with my name, time-stamped, before it leaves my mouth. Done. And if anyone in that design team takes something and presents it as their own, they won't, Riven said, because I will be in the room. Sable looked at him for a long moment. Why does that matter? Riven's voice didn't change. Because no one in my company has ever made that mistake in front of me twice. The corridor was still. Sable pressed the lift button. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, Riven confirmed. The lift arrived. Sable stepped in, turned to face forward. As the doors began to close, he said, not looking at Riven, looking at the middle distance the way people do when they're deciding how much of themselves to hand over. My father used to say that a good bridge isn't about the material. It's about understanding where the stress goes. If you understand the stress, you can design around anything. The doors closed. Riven stood in the empty corridor. He thought about that for a moment. Then he went back to the conference room, where 7 people were waiting. And for the first time in a very long meeting about a very expensive problem, the room had something it hadn't had 3 hours ago. A way forward. Chapter 4: What It Would Take. The first design session was held on a Monday morning in a smaller conference room on the 23rd floor. Not the executive suite, which Riven had chosen deliberately. A room without a power hierarchy built into its architecture. A room that said, we are here to solve something. He had arranged what Sable asked for. A standard consulting engagement contract, drafted overnight by his legal team, naming Sable Voss as a structural consultant on the highway overpass project. Intellectual property provisions were explicit. Any technical contribution by Sable, documented at the time of contribution, remained Sable's intellectual property, with a defined licensing arrangement to Calderon Group for the purpose of the project. His in-house IP counsel had raised an eyebrow at the clause. Riven had said nothing. The eyebrow lowered. The clause stayed. The contract was waiting on the table when Sable arrived at 8 a.m. Sable read every page. Not quickly. Riven sat at the far end of the table and worked on other correspondence while he did. He didn't watch. He didn't rush. He understood, with a precision that came from having negotiated in good faith and in bad faith and in every shade between, that the only currency that mattered right now was patience. After 40 minutes, Sable signed. And the work began. What followed over the next 11 days was, by the assessment of every engineer in the room, unlike any design process they had worked through before. Sable did not lead from the front. He didn't present to the team. He worked beside them, quietly, methodically, redirecting when the analysis went sideways, asking questions that sounded simple until the team tried to answer them and realized the question had already identified a problem they hadn't seen. If the stress transfer is symmetric under standard conditions, he said on day 3, leaning over a revised load diagram, what happens to the symmetry assumption when the northern foundation settles by even 2 millimeters over 5 years? The room went quiet, because nobody had run a long-term settlement differential scenario. Run it, he said, not as a command, just as the obvious next step. And the engineers ran it and found what he'd already intuited. A slow asymmetric foundation shift that would compound the load transfer vulnerability over time. He fixed that too. By day 7, the design had been rebuilt almost from the anchor junction outward, and the contracted engineers, The same men who had been barely willing to acknowledge Sable's presence at the midnight session were arguing over who got to present his corrections to the full review panel as if the question of attribution had never been in question. On day 8, Riven walked into the room and told them clearly that the contributor documentation was filed with legal and that every session transcript had been logged. The room got very quiet. The arguments about who got to present stopped. Sable said nothing about this. But that evening, passing Riven in the hallway, he looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Riven acknowledged this with a slight nod. It was not a dramatic moment. But between two people who communicated primarily in restraint, it meant something. The resistance came from inside the building, as Riven had expected it would. He had known it would come. Institutional resistance to disruption didn't announce itself. It worked quietly, in memos and misrouted communications and casual conversations at the wrong moment between the wrong people. He had built enough of an empire to understand that every system he'd ever improved had first tried to eject him. The first sign was a data anomaly on day 9. 3 of Sable's stress test result files, submitted to the shared project drive through the standard documentation system, were missing from the folder when the lead engineer opened it in the morning session. Not deleted, simply absent. The upload logs showed they had been received. They were not in the folder. Riven's IT director found them in a misrouted archive subfolder that technically existed for auto-quarantined files. It was technically a system error. It was also, technically, something a person with access permissions and a motive could have arranged to look like a system error. Riven made a note. He said nothing to the room. On day 11, a set of meeting notes from session 4, the session where Sable had identified the long-term settlement differential issue, circulated internally with a version of the discovery attributed to Soares, the senior contracted engineer. The version was careful. Soares was described as having raised a critical question about long-term settlement scenarios. Sable's name didn't appear. Sable found out because Torres forwarded him the document without comment. Riven found out because Torres forwarded it to him as well, also without comment. Torres was a man who expressed his opinions primarily through what he chose to CC. This time Riven didn't make a note. He walked to Soares' office and closed the door behind him. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. A corrected version of the meeting notes, with Sable's contribution properly attributed, circulated company-wide within the hour. Soares did not speak in the design sessions for the rest of the week. The conversation Riven had not been planning to have happened on a Thursday evening. He had stayed late in the project room reviewing the final pre-presentation design draft. Most of the team had gone. The building had the particular late evening quiet that Riven usually found preferable to the working day, the sound of institutional noise reduced to something more honest. Sable came back for a notebook he'd left. He found Riven at the table with the full design spread in front of him, working through the load calculations by hand. Not because he needed to, he had engineers for that. But because Riven Calderon was the kind of man who did not present something he didn't personally understand. Sable stopped in the doorway, then came to the table, sat down across from him without being invited. Riven looked up. "You're checking it yourself," Sable said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because if I stand in front of investors and tell them this design is structurally sound, I will have personally verified it." A pause. "I don't ask other people to carry risk I haven't assessed myself." Sable looked at him for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically. The way a door opens slightly, not all the way. He leaned forward and looked at the calculation Riven was working through. "Your load path notation is off here. The force vector should be resolved into components before you apply the transfer coefficient. You're treating it as a scalar." He reached across and corrected it with a pencil, gently, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like sitting across from the billionaire who employed him and correcting his mathematics was entirely unremarkable. Riven looked at the correction, then at Sable. "Thank you." Sable sat back. "You weren't far off. I was wrong." Off and wrong aren't the same thing. A small sound from Sable, not quite a laugh. Almost. They worked in silence for a few minutes. It was, Riven noticed, a comfortable silence. The kind that existed between people who were both actually thinking about the same problem. Then Sable said, without looking up from the diagram, "What are you going to do after the presentation?" Riven set down his pencil. "What do you mean?" "With me. With this." Sable gestured at the design spread between them. "The project ends. The consulting agreement ends. I go back to—" He stopped. "To whatever comes after this." The way he said it, flat, almost rehearsed, the tone of a person who has already made peace with disappointing outcomes, landed harder than Riven had expected. He looked at the design, then at Sable. "What would it take," he said carefully, "to rebuild your career properly? Not this project. Not a consulting arrangement. The whole thing." Sable looked up. "What do you mean?" "The Harwick scandal. The notation on your record. Fenmore's paper. What would it take to address all of it?" A long pause. Sable's expression did something complicated. "You'd need the original research notebooks. The ones I submitted before Fenmore filed his paper. They should be in the university archive. I submitted them through the department system as required. They'd have timestamps. If you compared them to Fenmore's publication date." "My investigators already located them," Riven said. "Through an academic archivist. They're in the file." Sable was very still. "They're in the file," he repeated. "Yes." The silence was different now. "You had evidence of academic fraud in your file for 2 weeks and you didn't—" Sable stopped himself. "I didn't move on it without your knowledge," Riven said. "It's your career, your history. I'm not in the practice of making decisions about other people's lives without consulting them." Sable looked at him for a long moment. The door opened a little further. "The problem," Sable said slowly, "is that even with the notebooks, Harwick has institutional reasons to protect Fenmore's reputation. He's published under their name. Any formal challenge gets lawyered into the ground. Not if the challenge is brought by someone whose legal resources significantly exceed the university's capacity to absorb prolonged institutional scrutiny," Riven said. Sable stared at him. "You'd pursue this?" "I find institutional cover-ups for intellectual theft." A pause, the briefest one, personally objectionable. It wasn't the full truth of why, but it was true. Sable looked down at the design between them. "There's another problem," he said. "Even if the record is cleared, even if Fenmore is held accountable, the engineering firms that blacklisted me aren't going to call. Cleared records don't rebuild a professional network. You need people who will vouch for you, who will put their name beside yours." He said it without self-pity, just clearly. The way an engineer describes a structural problem. Here is the load, here is the weak point, here is what fails. Riven looked at him. "Then we start there," he said. "After the presentation, the design review panel will have independent engineers. You'll have demonstrated your work publicly, with documentation. That's a professional foundation." A pause. "And for the network, I know every engineering firm that matters in this country. I have done business with most of them. My name beside yours would not be an obstacle." The room was very quiet. Sable said, after a moment, "Why are you doing this?" It was the second time he'd asked that question. This time Riven gave a different answer. He didn't give an answer at all. He looked at the design, the rebuilt anchor junction, the triangulated supports, the corrected load paths, and then he said, "The presentation is in 10 days. Let's make sure it holds." He picked up the pencil. After a moment, Sable picked up his. They worked in silence until midnight, and this time, neither of them noticed the time passing. Chapter 5: The Weight of the Span. The final 10 days had a quality Riven recognized from high-stakes negotiations. A kind of atmospheric pressure that didn't let up, that turned small problems into signals and ordinary silences into variables. He had worked under this kind of pressure for most of his adult life. What was different this time was that he was not the only one carrying it. The design team worked in 2 shifts. Sable worked both. He didn't seem to need sleep the way other people did, or if he did, he managed it somewhere Riven couldn't see. He was in the project room by 7 a.m. and still there at 11 p.m., working through stress scenario variations with a patience that the contracted engineers had begun to stop finding irritating and start finding useful. On day 3 of the final sprint, one of them, a younger engineer named Priol, who had been the only member of SOAR's team to be openly respectful from the start, stayed late voluntarily and sat across from Sable running load projections until midnight. Riven noted this. The design, by day 5 of the final sprint, was better than anything the contracted firm had originally been commissioned to deliver. Not marginally. The structural review panel that Riven had quietly asked to do an independent pre-assessment came back with a single-word summary. Sound. That was the good news. The complications came from everywhere else. On the 6th day, a document appeared. Not a leaked memo. Not a misrouted file. A formal internal complaint, routed through the company's HR compliance system, from 3 members of the contracted engineering team. The complaint alleged that an unauthorized external consultant had been granted improper access to proprietary project files without full board approval, and that the consulting arrangement had created liability exposure for the firm. The complaint named Sable Voss. It did not name SOAR's, who had signed the authorization for Sable's project file access 10 days earlier, when he still believed Sable's contribution would be absorbed into the team's general output without individual attribution. Riven read the complaint at 6 in the morning. He called his legal officer Dana Morrow at 6:05. The consulting contract is airtight, Morrow said without preamble. She had clearly already reviewed it. Full board approval isn't required for consulting engagements under this value threshold. The access authorization was signed by SOAR's, who had authority to grant it. The complaint is technically unfounded. And the intent behind it? A pause. Is transparent to anyone paying attention, Morrow said. Respond formally and document the response, Riven said. I want the complainants to understand that the paper trail for this project runs both directions. The formal response was filed by noon. The complaint was closed by end of day. What Riven did not immediately do was tell Sable. He went back and forth on this for approximately 6 hours before deciding that a man who had already had his work stolen by institutional silence deserved to know when an institution tried to silence him again, even when the attempt failed. He told him that evening. Sable sat with it for a moment. How many more of these are coming? He asked. Probably none, Riven said. The complaint is closed and documented. Another attempt would be a pattern, and patterns have legal implications. They know that. But you're not certain. I'm rarely certain of anything involving frightened people protecting their status. I'm certain that this specific attempt failed and that I've made the consequences of another attempt clear. A pause. Are you all right? Sable looked at him. The question had come out more directly than Riven had planned. I'm used to it, Sable said. That's not what I asked. The silence stretched for a moment. No, Sable said finally. I'm not entirely all right, because every time it happens I have to remind myself that I didn't imagine the first time. That what happened at Harwick was real and not something I caused. And that reminder, he stopped. Cost something, Riven finished. Sable looked at him with an expression that had something new in it. Not just the careful assessment. Something quieter. Yes, he said. It costs something. Riven said nothing for a moment. Then, for more days. Then it's over. Then the credit is documented in public and the next attempt, from anyone, runs into a record that's already been established. And after that? Sable asked. It was the 3rd time he had asked some version of that question. This time Riven didn't redirect. After that, he said. We have a different conversation. Sable held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Not dismissively, but the way a person looks away when they're not sure what to do with something that feels too good to trust yet. For days, he said. For days, Riven confirmed. The morning of the investor presentation, the penthouse was very quiet. Riven was dressed and ready by 7. He stood in the kitchen. His kitchen, the marble-floored room where this had all started, and drank coffee and looked out at the city going gray into morning and thought, with unusual clarity, about the difference between a system that ran perfectly and a life that actually contained something worth running. He had spent 15 years building the former. He was not sure until recently he had given much thought to the latter. He heard footsteps from the service corridor. Sable appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed for the presentation in clothes that were neat and clean but clearly not bought for a conference room, which Riven had already arranged to remedy quietly and without making it a gesture, sending a set of appropriate professional attire to the staff quarters the previous evening with a note that said only, for the presentation. Sable was wearing them. He looked. Riven took a single unhurried assessment. Like a man who had always belonged in rooms like the one they were about to enter, and who was simply not accustomed to being allowed in yet. "Ready?" Riven asked. Sable looked at him. "I've been ready for 3 years," he said quietly. They went. The investor presentation was held in the main conference space on the 41st floor, with a view of the Manhattan skyline that was designed to project exactly the kind of permanence and financial confidence that made investors feel their money was in stable hands. 14 people were in the room, 8 investors and their representatives. 2 independent structural review engineers from a firm Riven had engaged specifically because they had no prior relationship with either Calderon Group or the contracted design team. Petra Achabi and Harris Weld from the board. Dana Morrow legal. And Gail Torres, who had been at this company for 8 years and had never once been surprised by the way Riven ran a meeting. Today would be the first time. The presentation opened with Torres walking through the project overview and the design challenge. The structural vulnerability that had been identified, the risk to the project timeline, the potential liability exposure. He was clinical about it. Honest. Riven had insisted on that, no minimizing the problem, because the solution would mean more in a room that understood how serious the problem had been. Then he introduced the design correction. He put Sable's revised schematics on the projection screen. "The structural correction was developed by our consulting engineer," Torres said. "I'll ask him to walk you through the design." Sable stood. The room, Riven watched it carefully, did what rooms do when someone unexpected stands up. A fractional adjustment. A recalibration. The investors looked at him. At his age. At the clothes that were correct but not expensive. At the fact that no one had introduced him by title or institutional affiliation. And then Sable spoke. He walked them through the design with the same quiet clarity he'd used in every session. No performance, no bid for approval, just the work. He started with the failure mechanism, the asymmetric load transfer, the compound stress vulnerability, the way the original design would hold under standard conditions and fail under compound ones. He walked through the correction. The redistributed anchor junction, the triangulated supports, the symmetric load paths. He addressed the long-term settlement differential. He ran through the independent review panel's findings. He did not rush. He did not defer. He simply spoke about the design the way a man speaks about something he understands completely and is not afraid of. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way of people who have received more than they expected. One of the independent structural engineers spoke first. "The load path correction is not incremental. This is a fundamental structural reconceptualization. The triangulated anchor system in particular, I haven't seen this specific approach applied to a span of this scale. Where does it come from?" "My own research," Sable said. "From graduate work at Harwick. The application to this span is new, but the load distribution logic is proven." The engineer looked at him carefully. "Harwick? Under whom?" "I developed the relevant research independently," Sable said. "The academic record around it is complicated. But the research itself is documented and time-stamped and predates any published work on the subject." The engineer wrote something down. A major investor, a logistics infrastructure fund manager named Crestfield, who had been in the room for 3 previous Calderon presentations and asked one question at each, leaned forward. "Mr. Calderon, who is this?" The room turned to Riven. He had been expecting this moment, had prepared for it, had decided somewhere in the last 10 days exactly how he was going to answer it. "His name is Sable Voss," Riven said. "He's a structural engineer whose career was interrupted by an academic institution protecting one of its senior faculty members from a plagiarism finding. The research you've just seen is his. The design correction you've just heard is his." The documentation of both has been legally filed and is available to any party in this room who wishes to review it. The room was silent. He has been working as residential staff in my building, Riven continued, because that was the only employment available to someone who had been systematically excluded from his field. He paused. That situation is being corrected. Crestfield looked from Riven to Sable and back. Corrected how? That's a conversation for after we confirm the project, Riven said. Crestfield looked at Sable for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has been in enough rooms to know when he's watching something that will matter later. Approve the design, he said to the room, and I'd like to revisit the investment structure at the next board meeting. The vote was unanimous. The investors filed out. The engineers lingered to speak with Sable. Both independent reviewers, asking questions with the specific hunger of people who have found a problem that interests them. Sable answered each one. He did not look at Riven. He didn't need to. He was entirely present in the conversation happening in front of him, which was the conversation he had been waiting 3 years to have. Riven watched from across the room. Torres appeared beside him. You knew, Torres said quietly. From the beginning. The midnight observation. The background check. I suspected. You protected him. Riven didn't answer that directly. The design is sound, he said. That's what matters today. Torres was quiet for a moment. And tomorrow? Riven looked across the room at Sable, who was now sketching something on a notepad for the structural engineer. A quick diagram explaining something, pencil moving with the same automatic fluency it always had. Tomorrow we start the legal process on Harwick, Riven said. And I open the engineering division I've been planning for 2 years. I need a technical director. Torres looked at him. You planned the division before. I planned it for the right person. I didn't know who that was until 3 weeks ago. Torres said nothing for a moment. Then, does he know? Not yet. Torres nodded slowly. You should probably tell him before Crestfield tries to offer him something. Riven looked at him. Torres held the look with the mild expression of a man who had been watching his employer navigate impossible negotiations for 8 years and had learned to identify, with some precision, the kinds of problems that were professional and the kinds that weren't. He said nothing else. He simply walked away. That night, the penthouse was quiet again. Riven came home late. A second meeting with Crestfield, who had indeed wanted to discuss Sable immediately and had needed to be told, professionally and firmly, that Sable's next professional arrangement had already been decided. He hadn't spoken to Sable since the presentation. He wasn't sure why he had waited. That was unusual for him. Riven Calderon did not generally wait on things he had decided to do. He passed the kitchen hallway. Music. Soft. Low. The same small phone speaker. He stopped in the doorway. Sable was dancing. The same way he had been 3 weeks and an entire career change ago. Barefoot on the marble floor, moving with that particular controlled grace, red hair loose, the warm kitchen light catching the line of his shoulders. Except this time there was something different in it. Not looser exactly, not more performed, just lighter. The way a body moves when it has put something down that it has been carrying for a long time. He turned and saw Riven in the doorway. He didn't stop. He didn't look away. He just kept moving, slower now a little, and looked back at Riven with an expression that was entirely new. Not the wariness, not the careful assessment, not the grief. Something open, something that said, I know you're watching. I'm letting you. Riven stepped into the kitchen. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. He walked to the island counter, set down his jacket, and stood there the way he stood in rooms where things were about to be decided. Still present entirely himself. The music continued for a few more bars. Then Sable let it end. He stood in the middle of the kitchen floor, barefoot on the marble, and looked at Riven across the space between them. You stayed, Sable said. Not accusatory, just observing. I live here, Riven said. A sound from Sable. That almost laugh, the real one, the quiet one. You have something to tell me, Sable said, because he was the kind of person who had learned to read rooms, and the kind of room Riven occupied right now was the kind where something was being decided. I do, Riven said. The engineering division, Sable said. Riven looked at him. Torres told you. Torres told me you were planning a division. He didn't tell me the rest. Technical director, Riven said. Full authority over the engineering function. Your name on the work. Your methods. Your team built your way. A pause. Not as charity. Not because of the last 3 weeks. Because in the last 3 weeks you've demonstrated, in front of independent review and 12 investors, that you understand structural systems at a level my existing team does not. I am constitutionally incapable of ignoring that. Sable looked at him for a long moment. And Harwick. My legal team filed the initial inquiry today. The archivist who located your notebooks has agreed to provide a sworn statement on the timestamp evidence. Fenmore's department chair is about to discover that Calderon Group's legal budget is significantly larger than Harwick's litigation reserve. Sable was quiet. He looked down at the marble floor for a moment. At the same floor he danced across alone 3 weeks ago, believing no one was watching, believing the room and the night and the problem in the notebook were his alone. You're asking me to trust you, he said. I'm not asking you to trust me, Riven said. I'm offering you a documented, legally binding arrangement with full IP protection and complete professional autonomy. You don't have to trust me. The contract will do that work. Sable looked up. But, Riven held his gaze. But I would prefer that eventually you did. The kitchen was very still. The city moved outside the windows 40 floors below, indifferent and continuous. Sable walked toward the counter, stopped beside Riven, not across from him. Beside him, looking out at the same window, the same dark city, the same distance. My father told me something else, Sable said after a moment. He said, the most dangerous part of any bridge isn't the span. It's the foundation. Get the foundation wrong and it doesn't matter how good everything else is. He looked at Riven. I need to know the foundation is right before I build anything on it. That's fair, Riven said. It'll take time. I have time. A pause. I'm not easy, Sable said. Not a warning. Just an honest structural declaration. Neither am I, Riven said. I've been told it's a significant character flaw. This time the almost laugh became an actual one. Short. Real. The kind of laugh that exists in the gap between wariness and something better. Sable looked at him for a moment. Clearly, without the angle he'd been keeping since the beginning. All right, he said. One word. But it was the right word. The load-bearing one. The one everything else would eventually build from. Riven nodded once. They stood in the kitchen in the warm light. The same light that had illuminated one of them dancing alone 3 weeks ago, before the other had stopped in a doorway and decided to pay attention. Outside, the city continued its indifferent motion. Inside, something else entirely had begun. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, just the way the most structurally sound things always begin. Quietly, carefully, from the foundation up.